Did you know that birds are living dinosaurs? 66 million years ago, a huge asteroid struck Earth, triggering earthquakes, tsunamis, and global wildfires, plunging the planet into darkness and wiping out most species, including non-bird dinosaurs. Why did birds survive, and what else can we learn from this catastrophic event? Paleontologist Roger Benson of the American Museum of Natural History is the lead curator of the museum's new exhibit, Impact: The End of the Age of Dinosaurs. He joins me to talk asteroids, dinosaurs, and of course, birds. I'm Ramona Schindelheim. This is Birds and Nerds. Roger, thank you for joining the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
One thing I was thinking about when we first started talking about having you join the podcast was I did not know this, and I like birds. Birds are dinosaurs. I I I I find that really fascinating. People think dinosaurs are gone, but they're around us, all
That-
around us.
That's right. So all birds are dinosaurs, but not all dinosaurs are birds. Another way to think about this is birds are a type of dinosaur. And do you know that was first suggested in the 1800s by Thomas Henry Huxley? You
I
know,
did not know that.
yeah, and that was a time only a handful of dinosaur species were known. But the idea, it really didn't take hold until the 1990s when the first discoveries of dinosaurs with fossilized feathers on them were found in the early Cretaceous of China.
So what made him think? Do you know like some of his thinking around why he thought they were dinosaurs?
So dinosaurs were really revolutionary at the time. They were first recognized by scientists in the 1820s. And, by the middle of the 1800s, you're getting into the 1870s. Archaeopteryx, the oldest fossil bird, had been discovered by then. And scientists are really thinking hard about the origins of birds. And what Huxley did was he just compared features of the bones, and he saw that birds shared a bunch of features with dinosaurs, mainly in the pelvis and the hind limb. And interestingly, also that some dinosaurs share more features with birds than others. So he didn't just suggest that birds were somehow related to dinosaurs. He suggested that some dinosaurs were more closely related to birds than others. So birds are just a type of dinosaur then.
So I was reading about that discovery of the dinosaur fossils that had feathers. Tell me a little bit about that, because were they like the feathers that birds have now?
Sometimes, yeah. So some dinosaurs had truly bird-like feathers. That's not as common. And the bird-like feather, it's got this central axis called the rachis, and then it's got structures coming off to the sides called barbs, and it's got like many branching things that are kind of held together with little Velcro hooks. It gives the bird's quill feather its like coherent shape. That type of feather is present only in the most bird-like of dinosaurs, so the closest dinosaurian relatives of birds. And they include species like Microraptor. And Microraptor, it looks like it's a gliding or flying dinosaur. It's very closely related to birds. It has big feathery wing-like structures on its forelimbs, so it has wings on its arms, but also on its legs, which is pretty interesting. But among dinosaurs, we see kind of all stages of feather development. So starting from basically a single hollow filament to multiple filaments that branch at their base, a little bit like down, but not very closely. If you look up close, not so similar. So you can think of dinosaurs as either would have appeared fluffy, a bit like a mammal, so covered in hair-like structures, or feathery like a bird among some of the closest relatives of birds.
One of the things I also read was that I guess Jurassic Park got it wrong about velociraptors.
Well, yeah. So it depends what it means to get something wrong.
Yeah.
So Jurassic Park's velociraptor, that's actually based on an animal called Deinonychus. And Deinonychus is quite a bit bigger than Velociraptor. So that's the animal in the movie. Velociraptor itself is from Asia. Deinonychus is from North America. And Velociraptor is smaller. It's the size of maybe a big cat or a small dog. And it's got a longer snout than the animal in the movies. But they're quite closely related to each other. And Deinonychus was a particularly important dinosaur in the 1970s. It was discovered by a paleontologist at Yale, John Ostrom. And it's really closely related to birds. And, it belongs to a big group that also includes Velociraptor. But really, Ostrom studying Deinonychus revived the idea that birds were a type of dinosaur, so that birds are dinosaurs. And that was pretty contentious at the time. But by the 1990s, when you get these feathered dinosaur fossils, that's really sort of sealing the deal on this hypothesis.
So, I want to bring this to you have an exhibit right now at the American Museum of Natural History called Impact, and it talks about the asteroid that hit the Earth 66 million years ago. I think is what I think I got that right, and it it basically made most dinosaurs extinct. Why don't you tell me about that moment, and then I want to get to the idea of why then how did birds survive that? How did those? Because I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, scientifically, it's really fascinating too. So our new exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History, everyone should come. It's called Impact, the End of the Age of Dinosaurs. And it's centered around this. It's actually, it defies belief somehow. So we sit here, I'll tell you, 66 million years ago, a giant meteorite the size of Mount Everest struck the Earth. And this impact made many species extinct, both on land and in the oceans, and fundamentally changed the world as we know it. So life was never the same again. It actually sets the foundations for the modern world we live in. But one of the things that happens is dinosaurs become extinct. Almost all dinosaurs. Once you know that birds are dinosaurs, you know one group of dinosaurs survived, and that's the birds. If we look at patterns of who survived and who didn't, they give us some clues as to why species are surviving. And also, scientists worked really hard to understand what are the physical effects of a giant asteroid striking the Earth. So nobody's ever seen this happen, but we have a lot of evidence that it happened based on, various observations of geology. And it does contain a few clues as to what the physical effects could be, but a lot of our knowledge comes from sort of physical modeling, so in the physical sciences. But if we look at patterns of who goes extinct, well, if you're a large-bodied land animal, if you're a herbivore that depends on fresh vegetables, or you're a carnivore that depends on fresh herbivores, you really have no chance of surviving at all. And we think that that results from after the impact, there was at least several years where very little sunlight was making its
Oh,
way through the atmosphere because the atmosphere was all clouded with dust and gas and aerosols and other particles. So photosynthesis was almost shut down for several years, and this has catastrophic effects for ecosystems both on land and in the surface of the ocean. And because dinosaurs, by that time they're largely filling the role of giant land animals, they really need, they really need, they really depend on photosynthesis. They need plants in order to survive, or they need to eat each other. So ultimately, the dinosaurs, their food chain's based in plants, and they need the sun. Another thing that's happening though is, it's easy to see if you were standing at the point where the asteroid hit, how you might have quite a bad day. um, but what's not really obvious, but it's like scientifically really interesting to me, is there's so much heat created by this impact that there's a giant vapor plume that comes up from the impact site, and it would have looked like a towering plume that then spreads out as a mushroom cloud in the upper atmosphere. And it's so hot and under pressure, it's flashing straight upwards and just spreading out when you get to low air pressures near the top of the atmosphere. And it's actually spreading out over the entire Earth. And then lots of material is condensing out and raining down from this vapor plume globally. And each of those you can think of as a small piece of rock or a particle that's burning up on re-entry. And there are so many of these things that the entire upper atmosphere is heated. And in fact, heated to about 700 degrees C. So the whole Earth is a furnace this day. And that has devastating immediate effects. And really, to survive this, you need to be a small-bodied animal. We think animals are taking refuge either in burrows, the ones that survive, or in underwater in freshwater ecosystems, or they're extremely lucky and happen to be in just the right place. When we look at patterns of who survives and who doesn't in groups that do survive, like mammals and lizards, those animals at that time, they didn't attain the sizes of dinosaurs. They're generally small animals, but even among them, only the smallest survive. So you have to be below, say, 100 grams as a land animal. And there's really no dinosaurs of that size. The smallest dinosaurs are about 1 pound or 500 grams. And by then, that type of dinosaur is quite rare. So we know a little about what facilitates survival, but the really interesting thing is birds survived, but most birds didn't survive. There are whole groups of birds, including these animals, in enantiornithines. This means opposite birds. that were really important parts of terrestrial ecosystems at the end of the Age of Dinosaurs, and they become completely extinct, never to be seen again.
Hmm.
So if you were just picking, if your chance of survival just depended on how many species you had in a group, you wouldn't expect this very species-rich group of birds to become extinct. So we know there are some ecological traits or behavioral traits or something about modern birds that allows them to survive. But interestingly, we have no idea what those traits might have been. So we don't know why the birds that survived, we don't know why the birds we live with today survived this extinction event.
Let me ask a question here. I think I read that this happened to what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula. So does it seem, is there evidence that the survival rate, like on the other side of the world, was bigger, longer, better, and that maybe the evolution of birds started there and spread back?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting idea, actually. And that, scientifically, since the impact theory was proposed in the 1980s, we made an enormous amount of progress documenting what was alive before the boundary and after the boundary, but mostly in North America. So this is a place where there's lots of scientists, there's lots of rocks of the right age. People have a long tradition of paleontology, and patterns of extinction and survival on land and in the oceans are pretty well documented. We also know a lot from cores of sediment that are drilled out from the ocean floor. They preserve sometimes a near continuous record of changes in the plankton and the surface ocean. The remains of these organisms are raining down to the ocean floor. So we have a lot of information on what survives in the ocean. But actually on land, we don't have really detailed information about what's happening on most continents. So this leaves some really important questions unanswered. For example, the groups that survived, where did they primarily survive? We don't know if it's the happenstance of where the modern bird groups happened to live. We do have members of modern bird groups from the end of the Age of Dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous. And mostly the good fossils we have mostly belong to the group that includes ducks and geese today.
Yeah.
So we know that, the anseriforms, ducks and geese, their relatives survive and cross the boundary. And then they radiate again after the extinction. And, obviously they have lots of species today. And we know a little about their ecological traits. They're birds that are associated with water. But actually, we know a lot about the survivors, partly because they're with us today. But what we don't know enough about anywhere on Earth is really what was around just before the impact. What are the bird groups doing? A fossil record of those bird groups is mostly lots of bits and pieces of bones that don't really provide us like the full picture of the ecology of these animals. And that's really what stops us knowing why they survived. But it doesn't stop people suggesting ideas. So there's lots of hypotheses out there. So people have suggested that modern birds survived because they depended on seeds. People have suggested modern birds survived because they mostly depended on fish. And maybe there's some fish-eating ancestor to birds. Freshwater ecosystems do really well, so fish are a good food source for a survivor. People have suggested modern birds survive because they grow fast. Birds today do this incredible trick of doing most of their growth from a hatchling to an adult in months, which is incredible. That's faster growth than any other vertebrate. People have suggested they survive because they're smart and they had behavioral flexibility, so they can figure out what to do in the post-extinction world in a way that maybe other birds and dinosaurs couldn't. But really, we can't choose among these hypotheses. We don't have enough information about the pattern of extinction, which bird species were lost.
I had a question in there that I've been thinking about this for the last week. Do birds live longer or shorter lives now, modern birds, compared to maybe what their ancient relatives lived?
Oh, this is an amazing question, actually. I really would like to know the answer. We know a few things about this. We generally don't have much information on lifespan, like how long is the oldest individual. But the bones, as the bone grows, it leaves evidence of how long it was growing for. So in animals that are growing over a number of years, often they leave things called growth marks or lines of arrested growth. Those are marks in the bones that are a little bit like tree rings that record when growth slows down annually. So they allow us to count the age, the amount of time that an animal was growing for. And the very first birds that we see in the fossil record, so things like Archaeopteryx, and then there's an assemblage of birds. We have lots of amazing fossil birds from the early Cretaceous, so about 110 million years ago from China. Um, in that assemblage of birds, these animals are, we would have recognized them as birds, but they would have appeared different to us because they do things like they have teeth in their mouths. So they have teeth, and when we study when their growth has been studied by looking at the internal structure of their bones, it looks like they're doing their growth over several years. So they're biologically very, they resemble birds, but in some ways biologically they're not quite birds yet. By the end of the Cretaceous, our assemblage of birds on Earth includes animals that are growing as fast as living birds, but it probably also includes species of extinct bird that grew slowly like their ancestors. And it's possible that it's just the fast-growing birds that survived, leading to the world we live in today, where all of our birds grow incredibly quickly.
That's fascinating to me. I want to know more answers about that as well.
Well, I want to
And
know,
yeah.
we don't know. Yeah. So when you've got a group and there's so much variation in fundamental biological traits that in the living members are more or less fixed, we really want to know how quickly they make this transition, what processes are important, whether, you might have lots of groups that are growing slowly and they all individually evolve to grow quickly, or you might have one group that evolves to grow quickly and then somehow gradually takes over, or you might have pulse-like events of extinction, like when this asteroid struck the Earth, where you kind of clear the decks and you preferentially remove groups of species with one trait, and the survivors then have, a much narrower distribution of biological traits than before the extinction. And we ultimately, at the moment, we can't choose between these patterns because we just don't know enough yet.
So when you look at these fossils, when you go out and you're exploring and looking for these, um, what are you hoping to learn about maybe the world we live in now? How to survive? What's happening with us, climate wise? I mean, what are you trying to learn?
There's lots of answers to this question. When I actually go out looking for fossils in my work, I'm really looking for places where we didn't find a lot before. Different places that sample different times in Earth's history. So they give us a window into some place and time. And we really try to systematically sample in a way that we're gradually building a picture of what lived there at the time. I've been really interested in questions like, there's so many species on Earth today, but it's not immediately apparent if you go back in time whether there were more or fewer species than today. There probably are, in general, more species through time in Earth's history, so biodiversity probably is increasing. But then what's the pattern of that? So were there more species 30 million years ago? Sorry, how does the number of species on Earth 30 million years ago or 100 million years ago or 200 million years ago compared to today? And why? Like, what's causing changes in species diversity? But then in the assemblage of things we find, paleontologists, including myself, we're really keen to find fossils that tell us about where living groups come from. So in terms of what we can learn about today, well, today we see a world where there's some really well-defined groups. And they include birds. Birds are different to other reptiles. Their closest living relatives are the crocodilians. And honestly, it's difficult to think of two groups of vertebrates that are more different to each other. A bird is nothing like a croc. They're like at end members of being extremely reptilian in the crocodilians to being, a special high metabolic rate, intelligent, active animal that has enormous numbers of species, the birds. In the fossil record, evolution must have taken a path between, the ancestor of those groups and their present day members. And we're really excited to find things that tell us about the origins of groups. So if you're interested in where birds come from in the first place, the fossil record of dinosaurs turns out is where we find that information. So we see the sort of evolutionary assembly of all the features of birds that make them so special today. So that includes their feathers. We talked a little bit about feather evolution. It includes their biological traits, like how they grow. And it includes their anatomy. So we see their skeleton. That tells us not just about the skeletal anatomy, but also things like how muscles attached and how the animal worked. And that's a really important goal in paleontology. And then in the study of events in Earth's history, like this mass extinction event, there's a first order headline that it tells us, and it tells us that we live on a changing planet. And our planet has changed in the past, sometimes very slowly, sometimes incredibly abruptly. You can call the KPG impacts the worst day of the last 500 million years, if you want to. But we should expect that it's going to change in the past. And we should expect that it's going to change in the future. Sorry, we should continue changing in the future. And by looking at the past, we understand a little bit about the connections between how different changes in the Earth system affect things like the biosphere. So how does the biosphere change, in a warmer world? How does the biosphere change in a colder world? What are the effects of sea level and oceans flooding the continents? What are the effects of that on biodiversity and the way our planet works? So I think we have a lot to learn from the study of the past, and much of that is relevant to understanding how we got to the present and what might happen in the future of our planet.
Does your exhibit at the museum, does it look at that, the potential for, where we go from here? Is that part of your exhibit?
Yeah, we're interested towards the end of the exhibit in, could a mass extinction event happen again? And there's two aspects to that. One is, what are the chances of a meteorite the size of Mount Everest, 10 miles in diameter, striking the Earth again? And I'm sorry to tell you, it's almost certain that a giant meteorite will strike the Earth again. But on average, we expect to wait about 100 million years between these. So it probably, we have at least until after the holiday. uh, and we're also interested in, we're losing species at a very high rate compared to historical rates. Scientists interested in the fossil record, there are at least 5 big mass extinction events that happened on Earth since the origin of animals, of which the KPG impact is just one. Scientists have been really interested in asking the question of whether rates of species lost today are comparable to those during mass extinction events of the past. There's increasing consensus that they are comparable, but so far we haven't been doing that very long. So if we continue losing species at present rates for centuries or millennia, we certainly will have caused a mass extinction event, but we're not there yet. We still have some agency over what we want to do with this information and how we want to use our understanding of organisms and ecosystems and how the Earth works in order to, conserve important aspects of the biosphere, or even potentially restore things. And we focus on conservation success stories, so things that people are doing today that are actually having positive effects for biodiversity. And I think that's really important because, it's easy to just sort of lose hope on these things otherwise, but we do have agency here.
Do you like birds? Are you a bird person? Or is it, let me ask that question again. Do you like birds?
I like birds. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at birds in the air or in the trees because many places I go, I'm intently looking at the ground. I looked at a lot of birds over a number of years using X-rays. So I use a 3D X-ray method called micro CT scanning to capture the 3D internal and external structure of the skeleton. And I've been really interested in a long time in the structure of the bird skeleton. So I'd say I like birds, but I really like their skeletons.
Well, and I know that a lot of birds in their wings, I believe from a past podcast, are hollow. Otherwise, they would not be able to lift up and fly.
Well, this is a really interesting point. So, so when you say hollow, here we're talking about bones that actually contain air. And this seems really curious to us because you and me have hollow bones, but they don't contain air. They contain marrow and fats and other things, various fluids and solids. But you do have some air-filled bones in your skeleton, and they're in your face. The sinuses are air-filled chambers in various bones of the skull that are present in humans and are crazy in elephants. Elephants' skull is completely inflated with air. And if you get a sinus infection, that's the thing that's being inflated. But what birds have that's different to that is they don't just have air-filled bones in their skulls, but they have, the hornbill's crest is an example of something that's an inflated, air-filled bony structure. But birds also have air-filled bones in the rest of their skeleton. Now, that varies a lot among living birds. So penguins have essentially no air-filled bones in their skeleton. In a pelican, almost every single bone, even the pieces of the fingers and toes, are filled with air. And this is something we don't do. But do you know it's something that originally it first evolved in dinosaurs and it was inherited by birds from dinosaur ancestors. So it's also part of the explanation of why some dinosaurs were able to be so big. Because, if you can fill the skeleton with air, you're lower density, so for a given size, you weigh less, and everything is cheaper. Locomotion is cheaper. Force of gravity affects you less. It certainly helps birds to fly. It's certainly an important part of bird flight. If birds didn't inherit this feature from ancestors, if they didn't have air-filled bones in their skeletons, they probably still could fly, because bats can fly and they don't have this, for example. But it's likely that birds would be doing a bit less than they do today. It's likely this really facilitates some of the ecological diversity of birds.
Well, what I believe you have your own like personal paleontology quest to find the smallest dinosaur.
Yeah.
Uh, I wanted to know about that because I I read that your favorite bird is the inaccessible island rail,
Mm-hmm.
which is the smallest flightless bird. There seems to be some kind of connection there.
Yeah, there is a connection. I mean, I like the inaccessible island rail. I should say I've never seen one, but I read a bunch about them and CT scanned a few skeletons of them as well. But yeah, it's the smallest flightless bird. Apart from anything else, though, it's like the mystique. It's from Inaccessible Island.
Mhm.
It's like a distinctive bird. It's uniquely small among living flightless birds, and it's hard to get to. So it's a mysterious, exotic type of creature to me. I should say I went through a phase of I became a really big fan of flightless birds and all the groups that evolve flightlessness. Rails evolve flightlessness lots of times, but also groups like grebes and ducks. There are many flightless extinct duck and geese species. And they're different to, the famous big animals like moas or ostriches or elephant birds. So there's a lot going on there to the point that I thought, at some point my idea of a dream holiday would be going around the southern hemisphere trying to see all of these different flightless birds, but I'm not really there yet. But what's interesting about, a particular point of interest for me is how small are dinosaurs allowed to be. So the most common size for birds today is about 30 grams. So something about the body size of a sparrow. But other than in birds, the smallest adult dinosaurs we know about weighed about a pound or 500 grams or half a kilo. And actually among living birds, that's in the 90th percentile of living birds. So the smallest dinosaurs, if they were alive with us today, 9/10 of all living bird species would be smaller than them. And they're very far away. The smallest bird today, the bee hummingbird, weighs 2 grams. The smallest adult dinosaur outside of birds weighs 250 times that much. And, obviously paleontologists have been fascinated by how the biggest dinosaurs could be so big. But actually the question of why the smallest dinosaurs were so big compared to the smallest birds or the smallest members of other groups like mammals or lizards, this question is really overlooked, and actually we don't really know the answer. We don't know if it's because of unique biological traits of dinosaurs that basically means they just can't work at very small sizes like that, or whether it's because, they share the world with other animals, so things like our ancestors, the mammals. And maybe they're just like not competitive at small sizes. Maybe they're being bullied out of small body sizes by mammals. To me, that's very likely, but I'm really interested in how we go about testing these hypotheses and how we go about, because, we can't go back and do experiments on dinosaurs. But then the second part of this is when birds first evolved. So we see the first really bird-like animals, in the ancestry of birds in the early Cretaceous, so about 120 million years ago. And suddenly, when we get a window into their diversity, as we do in the early Cretaceous of China, suddenly there's loads of species, many more species than there are other dinosaurs in those ecosystems. And suddenly there are animals the size of sparrows. So when birds evolve, they smash through some of these limits on previous, on the evolution of other dinosaur groups. So I started out saying, well, birds are just a type of dinosaur, but they're not just any type of dinosaur. They're a like unique, special type of dinosaur that did something exceptional that no other dinosaur ever did, including flying, being small, and having like vast numbers of species in ecosystems.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate you giving us a different perspective on birds. Um, I've talked to many people who like live birds, and you're the first person I've spoken who likes X-raying birds.
Yeah.
Bones.
Well, it
But I
was
really
suddenly we could, if you're a bone person, I like bones, became a
yeah,
paleontologist. I've always been fascinated with bones. And
so
like
what
suddenly we have these methods where we can digitize whole skeletons and like study them in various ways. And that was pretty exciting for me.
so I'm gonna ask you, what made you what sparked your interest in being a paleontologist?
You know, I wanted to be a paleontologist when I was very young and I was really motivated by dinosaurs, but I didn't actually think it was really a thing you could do. I didn't think it was really plausible. So I went through various stages of other things. I wanted to be a veterinarian at some point. When I went to university, I wanted to be a physicist. And then sometime during the first year of my undergraduate degree, I realized it was a real thing you could do. You could be a paleontologist. And I really never looked back. I then, I started working hard. I was like hell bent on doing this. And I always wanted to discover cool stuff. Paleontology is a field where I don't like to say that one fossil could change everything, but we have some big questions about things like the origins of groups and the evolution of important traits, or how and why Earth was different in the past, and what happened. And by finding something, you can answer some of those questions, and that's a real dream of mine. And honestly, now the job I have, I just don't really. I think I'm going to wake up at some point, and this isn't my real job, but I
Well,
really love this stuff.
I appreciate that you didn't give up on your dream. And don't give up, even if it is a dream, just keep doing it
Yeah.
because you're
Well, you're never
enjoying
going
it.
to succeed without trying in the first place. And, there's some combination of luck and other things that factors into this, but you need, well, I don't know. No one can know why they succeeded. No one can distinguish luck from skill in themselves, but I'm just having a great time doing this. And I want to learn as much as possible about these animals and, questions like where birds come from or how ecosystems were different in the past.
Well, thank you, Roger, for sharing that with me, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've had a great time.
That was my interview with paleontologist Roger Benson of the American Museum of Natural History. I'm Ramona Schindelheim. Thanks for listening.